Okay, so you want to own a cruise line. Buy a massive ship, fill it with thousands of passengers, watch the money roll in from tickets, drinks, and shore excursions all at once. A floating city the size of several football fields, thousands of cabins sold out months in advance, a captive audience with nowhere else to spend their money for a week straight. That's the picture in your head. Walk through any cruise terminal on embarkation day, and it looks like one of the most obviously profitable businesses on Earth. Thousands of passengers streaming up the gangway. Every cabin booked. A line at the specialty restaurant reservation desk before the ship has even left port. You watch that scene and you think, this must be one of the easiest ways to print money in the entire travel industry. Here's the problem. You are looking at the one part of this business that was actually designed to look effortless, while the real financial engine runs almost entirely somewhere you can't see it from the dock. The truth is that a cruise line is not really in the business of selling cabins. It is in the business of selling you a ticket at a price that barely covers the ship's costs, and then spending the next 7 days convincing you to spend meaningfully more once you're floating in the middle of the ocean with nowhere else to go. And once you understand that, everything about how cruise lines make money in some years and nearly collapse entirely in others starts to make sense. Let's start with what it actually costs to get a ship in the water. There isn't one type of cruise line. There are several tiers, and the tier determines almost everything else about the economics. A mass market line runs enormous ships carrying 3,000 to 6,000 passengers, prices cabins aggressively low to fill every berth, and makes its real margin on everything sold once you're aboard. A premium line runs smaller, more upscale ships, charges meaningfully more per cabin, and leans less heavily on onboard spending because the base fare itself carries a healthier margin. A luxury line runs the smallest ships of all, sometimes under 1,000 passengers, charges the highest fares in the industry, and often bundles drinks, gratuities, and excursions into the ticket price specifically to feel effortless and exclusive. And an expedition line, the kind that sails to places like Antarctica or the Arctic, operates completely differently again, running small specialized vessels where the itinerary itself, not the ship's amenities, is the entire product being sold. Each of these is a different bet on the same underlying question. Do you make your money from the ticket or from everything you sell after the ticket has already gotten someone through the door? Now here's where the naive mental model breaks immediately. You think the biggest expense is building the ship. It is enormous, but it isn't the trap most new owners fall into. A new megaship capable of carrying 5,000 or 6,000 passengers can cost anywhere from $800 million to over $1.5 billion to build, financed through massive shipyard contracts placed years in advance, often in specialized shipyards in a handful of countries that have the capacity to build vessels of this size at all, with construction itself typically taking 2 to 3 years from contract signing to delivery. That's an enormous number, but it's a number cruise lines plan for over many years, financed with long-term debt structured around the ship's expected decades of service. The trap is somewhere else entirely, in the day-to-day cost of actually operating that ship once it's built. Fuel is the first brutal reality. A large cruise ship can burn somewhere between 80,000 and 150,000 gallons of fuel per day depending on its size, speed, and itinerary, and unlike a hotel sitting on solid ground, a cruise ship is a massive floating structure that has to physically move itself and everyone and everything on it across open ocean continuously, day after day, for the entire length of the voyage. Fuel costs can represent anywhere from 10 to 15% of total operating costs in a normal year, and that percentage can spike significantly when global fuel prices rise, with almost no ability for the cruise line to pass that cost increase directly onto passengers who already booked and paid for their cabin months or years in advance at a fixed price. Then there's the crew, and this is where cruise ship economics diverge sharply from almost any other hospitality business on land. A large cruise ship can require 1,500 to 2,000 crew members to operate, nearly one crew member for every 2 or 3 passengers, an extraordinarily labor-intensive ratio compared to a hotel on land, which typically operates with a fraction of that staffing relative to guest count. This labor-heavy structure exists because a ship has to be fully self-sufficient. There's no calling in a repair technician from town at 2 in the morning. There's no ordering more towels from a nearby supplier. Everything the ship needs for a week or more at sea has to already be aboard or produced on board, and every single system, from the engines to the water desalination plant to the kitchen, needs dedicated staff monitoring it around the clock. Every single day the ship is in operation. Crew members typically sign contracts running 4 to 9 months at a stretch, living aboard the ship in crew quarters well below the passenger decks, often sharing cabins with fellow crew members and working 6 or 7 days a week for the entire length of their contract before returning home for a break. A working arrangement that would be highly unusual, and in many cases simply illegal, for a comparable hospitality job based on land. Port fees are the next layer almost nobody outside the industry thinks about. Every time a ship docks at a port of call, it pays docking fees, per-passenger head taxes charged by local governments, and pilotage fees to bring the ship safely into harbor. These fees vary enormously by destination, but on a 7-day itinerary visiting 4 or 5 ports, the cumulative port fees and taxes can run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars per voyage for a large ship, a cost baked into the itinerary regardless of how many passengers actually get off the ship to explore. Some popular destinations have begun raising these per-passenger fees specifically in response to over-tourism concerns from local residents, meaning a port that was inexpensive to visit a few years ago can become meaningfully more costly to include on an itinerary today, forcing cruise lines to either absorb the increase, pass it along as a surcharge, or quietly drop that port from future sailings and replace it with a cheaper alternative that may be less appealing to passengers browsing itineraries online. Now, maintenance. And this is a cost that scales in a way most new owners underestimate entirely. A cruise ship operates in saltwater continuously, which is relentlessly corrosive to steel, and every few years, ships are required to go into dry dock for extensive inspection, repair, and refurbishment, sometimes taking the vessel completely out of revenue-generating service for several weeks at a time. A major dry dock overhaul on a large ship can cost tens of millions of dollars, covering everything from hull inspection and repainting to engine overhauls and interior refurbishment to keep the ship competitive against newer vessels entering the market, since passengers browsing itineraries online increasingly compare ship age and recent renovation status directly against competing sailings before ever booking a cabin. And unlike a hotel, which generates revenue every single day regardless of renovation schedules elsewhere in the building, a ship in dry dock generates zero passenger revenue for the entire time it's out of the water, while continuing to accrue significant repair costs. So add up the fuel, the enormous crew payroll, the port fees, and the dry dock maintenance reserve that has to be set aside every single year. And even before a single cabin has been sold, a large cruise ship can be carrying an extraordinary daily operating cost, often estimated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per day just to keep the ship running, regardless of how full it is. Now let's talk about the ticket itself, because this is where the business becomes genuinely strange. The base cruise fare, the number advertised in the brochure and on the booking website, is often priced remarkably close to the ship's actual per-passenger operating cost, sometimes barely above it, and during aggressive promotional periods, sometimes calculated to be a loss leader entirely. This isn't a mistake, it's the entire strategy. The cruise line's real profit doesn't come from the fare that gets you aboard. It comes from what happens after you've already committed, packed your bags, and boarded a ship in the middle of the ocean with genuinely limited alternatives for how to spend your time and money for the next several days. This is where onboard spending becomes the true engine of the business. Drink packages, specialty dining upcharges beyond the included buffet, spa treatments, casino gambling, shore excursions booked directly through the cruise line rather than independently, Wi-Fi packages and photography services all layered on top of the base fare once you're already committed to the voyage. Industry estimates suggest onboard spending can account for somewhere between 25% and 40% of a cruise line's total revenue, and critically, it tends to carry dramatically higher profit margins than the base ticket itself, because the marginal cost of serving one more specialty dinner or one more cocktail is small compared to what's charged for it. This is precisely why cruise lines design their ships the way they do. Casino floors positioned along the natural walking path between the dining room and the theater, specialty restaurants requiring a reservation and a separate charge even though a free buffet exists one deck away, and drink package pricing structured so that only genuinely heavy drinkers save money buying it outright, while everyone else pays a premium believing they're getting a deal. The casino specifically deserves its own mention, because maritime law creates a genuinely unusual advantage here. Cruise ship casinos typically only operate legally once the ship is in international waters, outside the territorial boundary of any single country's gambling regulations, which means the ship isn't just avoiding a specific country's gaming tax structure, it's operating in a regulatory environment the cruise line itself has enormous influence over, since the ship is essentially self-governing space once it clears territorial limits and remains so until it approaches the next port of call. This is part of why casino design on cruise ships is engineered so deliberately around psychology. No windows, no clocks, positioned at the center of the ship's main walking thoroughfare so that reaching almost anywhere else on board means walking past it. There's a structural detail sitting underneath almost this entire industry that most passengers never think about, and it has nothing to do with the ship's amenities. Nearly every major cruise ship sailing today is registered not in the country where its parent company is headquartered, but in a small number of nations offering what's called an open registry, sometimes referred to as a flag of convenience. A ship might be owned and operated by a company headquartered in one country, carry passengers who are almost entirely citizens of another, and yet legally fly the flag of a completely different, much smaller nation whose maritime registry offers significantly lower taxes and considerably more flexible labor regulations than the ship's home market would allow. This isn't a loophole in the sense of something hidden or improper. It's a completely legal and extremely common global shipping practice, but it has an enormous effect on cruise line economics specifically, because it allows the industry to largely sidestep certain corporate income taxes that a land-based hotel company of similar size and revenue would be required to pay in full, and it gives cruise lines considerably more latitude in structuring crew contracts, wages, and working hours than domestic labor law in the countries where their passengers actually live would typically permit. This single structural choice is a meaningful, quiet part of why cruise lines can price their base fares as aggressively low as they do while still eventually turning a profit. Then there's gratuities, which sit in an unusual gray zone between a genuine tip and something closer to a mandatory service charge. Most major cruise lines now automatically add a daily gratuity charge per passenger directly to the onboard account, often in the range of $15 to $20 per person per day, covering the cabin steward, dining staff, and other service personnel throughout the ship. While passengers can typically adjust or remove this charge by visiting guest services directly, the overwhelming majority simply leave it as billed, which means it functions, in practice, much more like a built-in service fee than a discretionary tip a passenger consciously chooses to leave. For the cruise line, this creates a predictable, calculable revenue stream that helps fund crew compensation without that cost showing up as a straightforward increase to the advertised base fare, keeping the headline ticket price looking more competitive on comparison websites while the actual total cost to the passenger ends up meaningfully higher once gratuities, drink packages, and excursions are added back in. Now, the psychology behind why passengers who complain loudly about the price of a mediocre cocktail keep paying for it anyway. Part of it is genuine captivity. There simply isn't another restaurant to walk to in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Part of it is what behavioral economists call sunk cost thinking. Having already spent thousands of dollars on the cruise itself, an additional $40 for a slightly better dinner feels proportionally smaller than it would on land. And part of it is deliberate design. Drink packages priced to feel like a bargain compared to paying per drink, even though the package itself is calculated to be profitable for the cruise line against average, not maximum, consumption. The physical layout of the ship reinforces this constantly. Casual dining areas positioned to require walking past specialty restaurant hostess stands. Photography staff positioned at every formal night and every port departure, printing physical photos nobody asked for but many people buy out of momentary sentiment. None of this is accidental. It's the same underlying logic as a gym's cancellation friction or a mall's anchor tenant foot traffic strategy, just applied inside a floating, captive environment with genuinely nowhere else to go. Here's the seasonal wrinkle that shapes a cruise line's entire financial calendar. Certain itineraries and regions have dramatically different demand throughout the year. Caribbean sailings peak during Northern Hemisphere winter when passengers are fleeing cold weather, while Mediterranean and Alaska itineraries peak during summer months when those regions are actually accessible and pleasant to sail. Cruise lines reposition their entire fleets seasonally, moving ships from one region to another as demand shifts, which means a ship generating strong revenue in the Caribbean during January might be repositioned to Europe by June, and that repositioning cruise itself, often sold at a steep discount because it's essentially a transitional voyage with less desirable ports, represents a period of meaningfully lower revenue per passenger, even though the ship's fixed daily operating costs remain exactly the same regardless of which ocean it happens to be crossing that week. There's also a loyalty and pre-booking mechanism worth understanding because it mirrors the airline miles bank in a genuinely important way. Cruise lines run tiered loyalty programs that reward repeat passengers with perks like onboard credit, priority boarding, and cabin upgrades. But the more financially significant mechanism is the future cruise deposit, a discounted booking a passenger can make while still aboard their current voyage, locking in a lower price for a future sailing years in advance in exchange for a relatively small, non-refundable deposit paid immediately. This does two things for the cruise line simultaneously. It generates real cash today, months or years before that future ship ever burns a gallon of fuel to sail it, and it locks in demand for future itineraries before marketing spend is even needed to fill those cabins. During periods of financial stress, this pre-booked future revenue, along with the deposits already collected, becomes an important part of a cruise line's available liquidity, cash that has technically already been earned even though the actual voyage and the actual cost of running it hasn't happened yet. Now let's talk about what can go catastrophically wrong, because cruise lines fail in an extraordinarily specific and brutal way that no other travel business quite matches. Take a look at what happened across the entire industry in 2020. It wasn't just that people stopped wanting to cruise. It was that cruise ships became, almost overnight, one of the most visible and widely reported symbols of a public health crisis, with several vessels held in extended quarantine at sea while news cameras filmed passengers waving from balconies. Demand didn't just soften, it effectively became illegal in many jurisdictions, with health authorities issuing formal no-sail orders that grounded entire fleets simultaneously for well over a year in some cases. And here's the part that makes cruise line economics uniquely dangerous during a crisis like that. Even with 0 passengers aboard, a cruise ship sitting idle at anchor still requires a skeleton crew to maintain its systems, still accrues insurance costs, still requires scheduled maintenance to prevent deterioration, and the enormous debt used to finance its construction absolutely does not pause simply because the ship isn't sailing. Several major cruise lines took on tens of billions of dollars in additional emergency debt during this period simply to survive with 0 revenue coming in for well over a year, debt that then had to be serviced for years afterward, even once sailings resumed, permanently altering the capital structure of the entire industry. This has happened before, at smaller scale, and it reveals something structural about this business. A cruise line's core assets, the ships themselves, are almost useless for anything else. You cannot quickly repurpose a cruise ship into a hotel, an office building, or a warehouse. It is an extraordinarily specialized, expensive asset with essentially one purpose. And when that purpose becomes temporarily impossible, the ship doesn't become a smaller liability, it becomes a full liability, still costing money every single day it sits unused, with genuinely no alternative revenue stream available to offset it. There's a real case study worth walking through here, because it shows exactly how quickly a fully booked, seemingly successful fleet can become a financial catastrophe. Several major cruise lines that appeared financially unshakable heading into that period, having posted record profits and record bookings for the better part of a decade, found themselves within a matter of weeks burning through cash reserves at a pace of tens of millions of dollars per day, per company, with every single ship in every single fleet sitting empty at anchor simultaneously. Credit rating agencies downgraded major cruise line debt multiple times within the same year. Share prices for publicly traded cruise companies fell by more than 70% from their pre-crisis highs. And several companies were forced to raise emergency capital at extraordinarily unfavorable terms, issuing new debt and equity at valuations that diluted existing shareholders significantly, simply to keep enough cash on hand to survive an indefinite period with literally 0 sailing revenue. The ships themselves hadn't gotten worse. The itineraries hadn't gotten worse. The entire extraordinarily specific business model, built around packing thousands of people into an enclosed floating space for a week at a time, simply became briefly, catastrophically incompatible with the world around it, and there was no way to quickly pivot the business model to anything else in the meantime. So how does a cruise line actually make money in plain mechanical terms once you strip away all of this? The core engine looks like this. Base fare revenue plus onboard spending revenue, minus fuel, crew payroll, port fees, and maintenance reserves. If a mid-sized ship carrying 3,000 passengers has daily operating costs of roughly $400,000, it needs enough combined ticket and onboard revenue per passenger per day to clear that threshold before generating any actual profit. Once that daily break-even threshold is cleared, and this mirrors exactly the same mechanical truth found in a gym or an airline, additional onboard spending from passengers who are already aboard is close to pure profit because the ship's fixed daily costs don't meaningfully increase whether a passenger spends $50 or $500 during the voyage. Here's the volatility that comes right after that math. Fuel prices, passenger demand, and the frequency of unplanned disruptions, weather delays, itinerary changes, occasional health incidents on board, all move independently of each other and rarely in the cruise line's favor simultaneously. A strong booking season can be undermined by a single quarter of elevated fuel costs. A well-planned itinerary can be disrupted by a hurricane forcing last-minute route changes and refunded port fees. And a single high-profile negative incident, a viral outbreak on board, a mechanical failure stranding a ship at sea can generate weeks of negative media coverage that measurably suppresses bookings across the entire industry, not just the specific ship or cruise line involved, because passengers considering a first cruise experience often can't distinguish between operators when deciding whether cruising in general still feels safe. Let's put together the two versions of a single year, because this is where the real picture shows itself. In the optimistic scenario, fuel prices stay moderate, no major itinerary disruptions occur. Onboard spending per passenger comes in strong because the ship's entertainment and dining offerings are landing well with this particular passenger mix, and occupancy runs consistently above 100% of double occupancy capacity, because cruise ships famously count triple and quadruple occupancy cabins as generating additional revenue beyond the ship's base passenger capacity. Under those conditions, a well-run mid-sized cruise line can generate healthy net profit margins in the high single digits to low double digits, a genuinely strong outcome given the enormous capital investment required to enter this business. In the realistic scenario, fuel costs spike unexpectedly mid-year. A major storm system disrupts several sailings in a row, requiring costly itinerary changes and passenger compensation. A widely reported illness outbreak on one ship in the fleet suppresses bookings across the entire brand for months afterward, regardless of which specific vessel was actually affected, and onboard spending comes in soft, because the passenger demographic that quarter skews toward more price-conscious travelers who are more resistant to onboard upselling. Under those conditions, that same cruise line can slide from a comfortable profit margin into a single-digit margin or an outright quarterly loss, even while every single ship in the fleet continues sailing at near full capacity, gangways packed, casinos busy, dining rooms full every single night. The difference between those two outcomes across a single year can run into hundreds of millions of dollars for a major cruise line operating dozens of ships simultaneously, and almost none of it shows up as one dramatic headline event. It's a slightly higher fuel bill here, a softer onboard spending quarter there, one weather-disrupted itinerary compounding quietly against another, until the number at the bottom of the annual report looks nothing like what the fully booked ships pulling into port every single week would have suggested to anyone standing on the dock watching them arrive. The gangway still lowers on schedule. The buffet is still packed at lunch. The pool deck still fills up the moment the ship clears the harbor. From the dock, the good year and the bad year look completely indistinguishable, because the difference was never something a passenger walking up the gangway could actually see. So if you ever find yourself dreaming about owning a cruise line, remember the one thing that actually determines whether you survive in this business. It was never really about how many cabins you can sell. It's about how well you can convince several thousand captive passengers, floating in the middle of an ocean with nowhere else to spend their money, to keep opening their wallets one day at a time.